Welcome back to another amazing episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. It is Dorothy, your host, back again with another amazing guest to bring to you guys today. Her name is Patty McCormick, a two-time National Book Award finalist, is the author of several critically acclaimed novels, including Never Fall Down, which is a true story of a boy who survived the killing fields of Cambodia by playing music for the Khmer Rouge, as well as a super popular one, Sold, a moving account of sexual trafficking. Her books have been named in the New York Times Notable Books list, Publishers Weekly Best Book List, NPR, iTunes Best Book List. Her honors include the New York Foundation on the Arts Fellowship, Virginia Center of Creative Arts Fellowship, and the McDowell Center Fellowship. So many for us, and I'm so excited to have her on today. Patty, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dorothy. I so admire your work, and I'm really happy to be here.
So before we get into the book, Never Fall Down, which is going to be kind of the main topic we're going to kind of peel back today, you graduated from Columbia with a master's in journalism. Did you know that you always wanted to write books?
You know, I think I did. I was a kid who grew up in a kind of difficult household, and I was a lonely kid. So I entertained myself by writing. I sort of wrote my way out of my childhood environment, but I wasn't really sure how a person became a writer. Do you know that leap between what you see on the page at the book that you get at the library and how that process actually comes to fruition? So that's why I went to the journalism school. And first I was a newspaper reporter, which I loved, and which gave me the courage to ask people difficult questions and also helped me to get over the fear of the blank page. You know, when you're working for a daily newspaper, they come around every afternoon at 3:00 and say, "What do you have for tomorrow's front page of the paper?" And you want to pitch the story. If you get the go ahead, you've got 3 hours to finish it. That's basically how I went from somebody who just loved writing and needed writing to being somebody who made a career in writing.
Okay. It really didn't surprise me at all because, I mean, if you look at the type of topics that you like to focus on, they're not easy topics and they're almost investigative in nature. And so when I saw that you had a background in journalism, it didn't surprise me. And definitely, you know, if you were to look at the topics that you cover, you don't shy away from hard topics. What is your motivation and purpose when it comes to every book that you decide to write?
Everybody both teases me and respects, I think, the fact that my books they cover dark topics. I don't think the books themselves are dark necessarily. But for me, it feels like if I'm going to invest 2 years of my life in something, I want it to really be about something. I want it to make a difference. I'm also not somebody who is gifted at writing rom-com or lighter fare. I'm drawn to these topics in a very profound way. So it's kind of a match of this sense that I have of using what skills I have to make the world, to shine light on things that are in the darkness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you find you have a feeling that tells you, oh my gosh, this is something that I have to write about? Or what is your process when it comes to kind of finding these topics?
Man, you sound like my soul sister. That is exactly how I feel. When I see a story, I think, oh my gosh, somebody should write a book about that. And for instance, the book Sold that you mentioned, I read about child trafficking as an issue and thought, well, somebody needs to tell this story from the girl's point of view. Once I saw that no one else had yet done that, I just couldn't stay away from it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really admirable to want to tackle these topics. And I think a big reason why people don't is the fact that in order to really get the perspective of the person who had survived the trauma that you're trying to cover, you also have to put yourself in a vulnerable position to really accept that and really like dive deep and be there with them. And that's hard, I think, emotionally. Has that ever been something that you struggled with or you kind of shied away from or you found difficult?
You're absolutely right that I think people shy away from these topics because they think it's going to be difficult for the listener. And the truth of the matter is, at least for me, that it's an incredible privilege to bear witness to those stories and to hold them with love and respect. And is it scary? Maybe a little. I think part of the way that I have helped interview subjects become comfortable with tough questions is to share a little bit about my own background. That, I think, helps put us on a more human footing, not necessarily an equal footing, but just a human footing. Mm-hmm. And one of the most moving experiences I had in writing Never Fall Down, I spent about a month in Cambodia and interviewed lots and lots of people. But there was one man that I interviewed to help corroborate the main story that I was telling. And he was a farmer. And I started asking him questions, and he just burst into tears. And I was lucky to be working with a really gifted young man who was my translator. And I instantly was concerned that I had touched on something early in the interview that was painful for this man. And he said, "No, I'm crying out of happiness. I never thought anyone would be interested in my story. I never dreamed an American woman would care about what happened to me." And so that privilege of connecting with somebody that has been burdened by their story. And I think a big part of the burden is that feeling of aloneness, like no one cares. And so I think once you're able to communicate a sense of genuine interest and care and respect, then people really want to open up.
Mm-hmm. I relate to that exactly because I had interviewed my own father. It's as if you're watching them let go of something that they've been holding on to for so long. You're watching that weight slowly but surely come off of their back. You're watching them heal, I think, right before your very eyes. And that's not something that I think a lot of people can say that they have witnessed directly in front of them before. So I want to take it back a little bit. You had met Arne through a friend, a neighbor when you were living in New York. Even before you had stumbled upon him, what did you know about the Khmer Rouge, and how was media portraying the Khmer Rouge at that time?
That is such a key question. I was a high school student during the 4 years of the reign of the Khmer Rouge, and I wasn't especially politically savvy or politically interested. And I think, like a lot of people in the United States, I had tuned out a lot of what was happening in that part of the world post-Vietnam War. I think people in the U.S. had a certain fatigue about caring about what was happening in that part of the world. Also, and I don't need to tell you this, and since you had Elizabeth Becker as one of your guests, you know this all too well, the country was in lockdown and no information got out during those 4 years. So people can, I suppose, be forgiven for not knowing what was going on while it was happening because of that news blackout. But once her reports started coming out, people didn't believe them. And maybe because they seemed so horrific. But I think I was like a lot of young people in my generation of that time. I didn't know much about Cambodia, except that it was right near Vietnam. And I knew that there was this terrible American shame, us having bombed Cambodia. But I don't think I knew the ways in which that bombing campaign laid the groundwork for the genocide.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was media focusing on the genocide or more so the fact that the Vietnam War was over? Because we're talking about the same timeline here, right around the same time. What did media focus on more?
I think it was about the fact that the war was over, and then to a degree, the way in which Vietnam veterans were being treated when they came home. And the country was still so divided at that time, even though the war was technically over. The Cultural War in the United States was still going on. And, like a lot of people, Americans can be very myopic. We think we're the center of the world.
Right. And it's also hard to talk about things that you're shameful of, or that the country is shameful of. So that must mean then when you met Arne, and I'd love to talk a little bit about how you met him, exactly what that whole experience was like. But that must mean that when you really heard about his story, it kind of opened your eyes to what really was happening.
Very much so. I had read in the intervening years a little bit more, so I was more aware of year zero and the atrocities that followed, but I hadn't met anybody from Cambodia. And as soon as I met Arne, so a neighbor introduced us, and he said, "Oh, I know what your next book should be. You should write about this young man who survived the Khmer Rouge by playing music." And I was interested, but sort of polite, because people are always telling me what my next book should be about. Because I didn't know enough about Cambodia to give an educated answer, I was just sort of polite. But then I met Arne, and he has so much charisma, so much resilience, so much joy. And he was bursting with a story to tell, a tragic story, as well as a redemptive and a hopeful story. But because he had such intensity about it, he's such a huge need for people to hear it, he kind of got in his own way in terms of telling it. The darkest parts, he would tell forcefully to try to impress upon the listener, like, this was really bad. But then he'd quickly skirt away from that to talk about the ways in which he had come back to Cambodia to revitalize the traditional music. So he was all over the place in terms of his ability to tell the story, or his ability to put it in context. He was 11. And so when you're that 11 to, let's say, 15, when you're that young, and that is a significant portion of your entire life, that's all you know. It was hard for him to look back to the factors that caused the rise of the Khmer Rouge. And it was equally hard at times for him to give me the very specific details about his experience that I needed to make that story come to life.
Do you remember the exact moment, either a story that he told you or something that you couldn't shake, the exact moment that you thought in your head, I'm going to write your story and I'm going to need to write this book?
I don't remember a specific incident of the many stories that he told me. It was his energy. I knew almost immediately the way, and he could tell a really great story. He talked about, the parade that came through Battambang when the Khmer Rouge came to power, and the celebratory feeling that everybody had after the war. It was so vivid, and it was so full of that childlike innocence that everybody is entitled to have. And then it got so dark so fast. I think, too, his deep grief and longing for his family came through. So he had this childlike joy and this childlike wonder about what had happened to his world, as well as, where's my sister? What happened to my little brother? This urgency about it. And the pain was still very, very raw. But I think I felt that by putting it in a book, if I could wrangle him, and it did involve a lot of wrangling, if I could help him organize this story together, we could do something valuable.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if his storytelling while you were interviewing him was a similar experience to the way that my father told his story when I was interviewing, in that, my father is a very charismatic man as well, but when I had put him in the interview room, I can feel that there were moments that I was getting close to something very, very touchy, and he would back away, and he would turn the topic or revert to something else or stop talking. What was that interview process like? I know that you spent a total of 2 years interviewing him, if I'm not mistaken. What was that process like, and how did he handle it?
Do you know, those experiences are so similar, what you had interviewing your dad, and I can only imagine how much more tender it was, given that it was your father.
Mm-hmm.
But Arne and I, you're right, we spent years working together, getting to know each other and getting to know his story. And we would get close to something that was very painful, and he would just jump away. And eventually, I would have to corral him and bring him back. There was one really difficult story that he told me about a woman who had been lying in the sun and she was dying. Her wounds meant that all of her vital organs were already exposed. She was just lying in the sun, a slow, miserable death. And she begged him to kill her. Now, he's a child, okay? But he has a gun. And he would tell me that, and then he would tell me about something that happened at his life in America, the first time he went to McDonald's. Something so completely unrelated. It was like he couldn't get away from that fast enough. And so finally, I had to say, Arne, did you kill her? And he was sort of shocked that I asked. And then he wept and said, yes, that he had, that it was a mercy. And he needed to have somebody ask that question. Otherwise, it was going to stay inside him and haunt him. And we were able to process it together. And, for me to remind him that he was a child and that he had to do many things to survive that you wouldn't do in any other circumstances in your life. But he seemed, after that, and we were exhausted after these interview sessions, he seemed so lightened having told that to me. I said to him that it was a sign of my deep respect for him, that I knew I could ask him a difficult question and he would answer it. Often he cried, and just as often probably I cried, which I think is also an important, you can't control these things, but I felt like it created this very human connection between us. Sometimes I didn't cry, and it was, I had to hold on to myself, but as a way to show him, look, you can tell me anything and it's not going to break me. You can tell me anything and I'm not going to judge you. And so that's really how the process went. And, whenever we would get to something really tough like that, and he would reveal something that he hadn't shared before, he would seem lighter. And he would also seem more mature. There's a way in which he was very boy-like in his affect, very young. And the more he stepped up and was accountable, as much as any child soldier can be accountable, he became more of a man than a traumatized boy. But while he was telling me these stories, and I don't know if it was like this with your dad, he would revert to the persona, to the psyche that he was back then.
Yeah. I tell my father that, well, actually, our relationship has changed significantly after these interviews, similar to the way that you have now this bond with Arne. I tell other people who ask me that for the first time after these interviews with my father, for the first time, I can actually look at him and see the boy that he was. And considering that I grew up, when I was growing up, my father has been a very, very stern, firm, rigid figure, as most men are of that generation. And it was the first time that I was actually able to look at my dad as if he once was a child, just like the rest of us. And I can imagine then through this process with Arne, like, what was your process? Did you have days in between the interviews? I'm sure going back to back would be exhausting. Did you do the interviews someplace out in the woods to make him feel more relaxed? Like, what were the things that needed to be in place for him to be in that mental capacity?
They took all different kinds of shapes. Often we would have a meal first or a meal afterward. That seemed to be a good way to nourish him and me, either get fortified for the interview or give ourselves some nourishment afterward. Most of the interviews were done in my apartment in New York, except for that month that I was in Cambodia. We did a lot more interviewing there. Part of the trick was to organize all this material and try to create a timeline. And that wasn't easy because the experience, as you know from hearing your father's experience and others, it is so chaotic and you lose track of time. And in fact, time was kind of eradicated during that period. So it's not like people can clock it to a birthday or a holiday or a year. But he would tell me these stories, and I got a big, giant piece of poster board and then another one. And we would try to create a timeline as best we could to be faithful to what historical things we knew were happening at these different times and places. And then I tried to organize my notes. I tried to do a sort of color-coded thing to organize them into different sections: his childhood before the Khmer Rouge, the years in the internment camps, the year when he was a soldier, the refugee camp, and onward. But the chaos, it's just hard to overstate how chaotic it feels to the survivor.
Mm-hmm. And how old was he when these interviews were happening with him?
He was in his 40s at that point.
Okay.
You know, he still looks super young and has a very buoyant, youthful way of being in the world. But yeah, he was a grown man.
Okay. And you must have gained so much trust, or he had given you so much trust. My dad tells me all the time that had it been a stranger or somebody else asking him these really difficult questions, if it hadn't been me, his own daughter, he doesn't know if he would have gotten to the root of things. So I think the fact, as you said before, the fact that he was able to answer these truthfully to you only shows the level of trust, and also the willingness for him to share. He must have been ecstatic when he stumbled upon somebody wanting to tell his story.
It was love at first sight. We really do love each other now like brother and sister. I think at the time, he knew that I had written other books about children under enormous pressures. So he knew that I could take it all the way to the finish line. But that doesn't mean it was mostly always easy. But there were a couple different times where he would shy away, or people who were talking to him about this would say, "Oh, don't trust this American writer. She's going to steal your story." And he had tried with others in the past, and it fell apart. So it really did take a big leap for him to trust me. And I think a big part of this process, and maybe it was the same way with your dad, is just hanging in there day after day, just showing up as the same person, being reliable, being a good listener, making things feel safe. It's not a magic sauce or anything like that. But I think when you've had that kind of trauma and you're getting ready to share those upsetting and tender and shameful things, I think you need proof that that person who's going to hold them and listen to them is going to be consistent and steady every day.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really, really great advice to anybody who wants to talk to their parent, or to talk to anybody who has a significant amount of trauma. I say that because I have a lot of my listenership asking me, how did you get your dad to open up. Like, there's no way that I could get my dad to, or what's the A, B, and C to make this happen? And to be honest, it's a very hard question to answer, right? Because it's a matter of just honestly showing up and creating that safety for them. Talk to me a little bit about going to Cambodia to continue supplementing this research. What was the purpose of that? Did you go with Arne? What were you trying to find in Cambodia on that trip?
I wanted to go to Cambodia. He'd made it such a lively place in my imagination by then that I wanted desperately to see the country that he loved so much. I also knew, as a white woman from, my particular background, I needed to go. I needed to have the humility to say, I don't know this culture. It's not mine. And to do all the research and ask the dumb questions. Don't pretend that I know what I don't know. To eat the food, to look at the color of the dirt and say, okay, is it red? Is it rust colored? Is it brown? So that when I put it in the book, the people who really have had that experience, somebody like your dad, would say, yep, that's right. As opposed to, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Yet another interloper coming along thinking they know who we are and what we're about. So I took that responsibility very, very seriously. And this was before the whole cultural appropriation movement. And my only source for all these interviews, all this entire book up until then, was Arne. And he's incredibly truthful. He's incredibly honest. But I needed to verify as much as I possibly could. And so he arranged for me to meet some of the men who were soldiers along with him or in the camp with him to verify. And he would be out of earshot. And my translator would help me ask these questions. And I learned that the only things that Arne held back were stories that made him look good. So, he told me about stealing food. He didn't tell me that he stole it and then gave it to some of these friends. He didn't want to come off like he was bragging. So it was an important part of the story, not just to verify that the terrible things he said were accurate, but to hear other people round out a portrait of this young man. The only other thing I'll say, I loved Cambodia and would happily go back. It was a great experience for me. I was with Arne and a bunch of his buddies and friends, and all of us riding around in a Jeep, and music is playing the whole time and everybody's talking. I alone couldn't understand a word that was being said. And everybody should have that experience. If you think that it's easy to come to a country as an immigrant or as a refugee and not understand anything, spend, an afternoon, let alone, months and months, being completely on the outside of the language and the culture. It's a very good experience to have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you were there for a full year?
No, in Cambodia, I was just there for a month.
Oh, for a month. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Shortly after this trip to Cambodia, you then put together the book. Had you finished the interviews at that point? And from then on, it's just you putting yourself in the perspective of him to write it, or what was that timeline looking like?
I don't think I did any other writing until I got back and synthesized everything.
Right.
There were a couple scenes that I knew how to approach them, but I wasn't really sure how to start the book. And it wasn't until I was in Cambodia and in Battambang and got a sense of this place, this incredibly vibrant town that's all about music and the arts, that I was able to begin the book.
Mm-hmm. What was the most challenging aspect of putting this book together?
The most challenging part was what I went through, obviously, is nothing compared to what the survivors and their families endured. But to drop into that experience every day and pretend to be Arne right from the first person, that darkness, that depravity, you can't just close your computer and walk away from that. That stays with you. Thank God Arne had a hopeful and always loving attitude, even at the worst of times. He was even funny. He pulled pranks at the camp. He was still a kid. I think that piece of him stayed alive. I think the hardest moment in the book was when he felt as though he had really lost hope, and that he felt that he personally had become as savage as the people who had inflicted so much pain on him and his family and families like yours. That was really, really a low point in the book. So I'd say for me, it was just this sense that I would have to go in my mind to those years every day. And then I couldn't shake it off right away at the end of the day. I'm thinking about it now as you say it, the heaviness that I felt. There were times when I felt depressed about the enormity of the book and trying to do justice to this incredible experience and his incredible resilience. I never wanted to make him sound like a victim, and I hope that he did not. But what got me through the harder parts for me was feeling like I'm going to make a difference with this book. There's so many people like me who do not know this story. And there are so few accounts from the kids' point of view that I felt, if I felt depressed about the content of the story, that depression would lift when I had that sense of the powerlessness would leave me when I felt, okay, I've got power here to tell this story.
Mm-hmm. I think what makes this story also so unique is, we mentioned a little bit even before we started recording that it's very rare to find people to actually want to tell their story. The majority of Khmer Rouge survivors out there want to just take it to the grave. They want to shut that door and never open it up again. But I think what makes this one even more unique is the people and the children who were unfortunately put in the position with a gun in their hands, like Arne. Many of them leave the 4 years with so much shame and that much more guilt because they were being put on the other side, the bad side.
Right.
And it's really not easy to say that out loud because the people who had survived the Khmer Rouge and didn't have the gun in their hands, most of them still blame the people who had the guns for their families, for the atrocities that happened. And so when you were in Cambodia, sitting with him, Arne, and the other fellow survivors who had that same experience, did you find that Arne's struggles were similar to the guys that he was also sitting with? And if so, what do you think was his biggest challenge in terms of this entire process?
I think you made a really good point about this notion that we would like the world to be divided very neatly into victims and oppressors, or victims and perpetrators. Mm-hmm. But the truth in virtually every conflict, and certainly in this one, is that each side, each victim, and I shouldn't say each, I don't know that for a fact, many of the victims had to do unthinkable things to survive, had to behave in ways like oppressors. And many of the oppressors were forced into service or their families would be killed. So nobody had free choice or completely free choice in this situation. And people want to remember, as human beings, we're all programmed to want to remember what we did that was good or valorous or brave. And we want to forget the other things that we had to do in a completely insane situation to survive. I think you made another really good point. When I was in Cambodia, I asked, why not have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And what I was told was that the peace is very fragile. And at that point, too, the economy was very fragile. And you might be living right next door to somebody who was former Khmer Rouge. And he or she isn't going to feel safe saying that to his next door neighbor if that neighbor lost people. And the truth is, it sounds like everybody lost people. I think in terms of talking to survivors, it's important to be respectful that there are things that people do not want to divulge. Arne was unusual in the way that he needed to get certain things out. And I think you just have to be super careful about respecting that. Unearthing some of this, especially some of the worst things that people had to do, can really destabilize them. They've been through a lot, and their stability is really hard won. And so if it is their decision to keep it to themselves, then God bless. We need to respect that.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a Truth and Reconciliation. What is that? Is that like a circle or?
You know, it's most well known in South Africa, where
Oh.
after apartheid was dismantled, white people came forward, and this is a gross oversimplification of it, but white people came forward and admitted many of the things that they had done to their to the black citizens, their fellow citizens. And there was a measure of official forgiveness given. And I think that was in part because they thought in that case that the whole country would come unraveled with lawsuits and trials if they tried to hold everybody who was ever an oppressor accountable. So this was kind of a general thing that played out where a number of high profile white people were accountable. But I think apparently that wouldn't work in Cambodia, and I understand why.
Mm-hmm. I know that we had the trials that we had held here, but I don't think that would. I mean, things would be different in Cambodia, I would assume. Again, exactly to your point, that how are you going to approach this when half, if not all, of the people didn't feel like they had the freedom or the choice to be in the position they were in? It seems like through this process, though, Arne has been able to heal. You mentioned that pre-interview versus post-interview Arne is a whole lot lighter. Did he ever say anything to you, or what were kind of the evident pieces that you had noticed in his mood and the way that he was starting to change through this storytelling?
Remember, I talked about how he had so much urgency to tell, and the telling was in a very scrambled way.
Mm-hmm.
When the book was finished, he kind of laid that down. He would hold the book up and say, "It's all in here." And I think he felt like the book was his ambassador, that it would go out to everybody. Part of his urgency was, can I tell this person? Can I tell that person? And a book is your ambassador in the world, so you don't have to do that work over and over again. The other remarkable thing about Arne was, even before we had worked on the book together, he worked to revitalize traditional music. He channeled a lot of his energy into music. He had had a musical family. That's why he survived, because he played music, and he wanted to redeem music for Cambodians and remind them of the proud and beautiful musical traditions that were all but wiped out. And so I think that gave him a lot of buoyancy and a big sense of purpose in the world.
Mm-hmm. I had read somewhere that when you were back in Cambodia as well, you were able to hear the music, the propaganda music that they had to learn. I can also imagine just the transition of Arne from having this talent of music and going through the Khmer Rouge and unfortunately having to taint that by using the music in the way he doesn't want to use it. It doesn't surprise me then that post Khmer Rouge, he wants to reclaim it in a more positive way because he leaned on it for survival and he played the songs that he maybe did not 100% agree with, but needed to reclaim that for himself. Right?
Yes, that taint is exactly the right word for it. And when you mentioned hearing the propaganda music, so he got together several of the guys who were in that band, and they were in a garage and they had some instruments and they started playing some of the propaganda music and they started to laugh hysterically, partly because the lyrics are really, really over the top.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also a way of saying, this is ridiculous. This isn't music. We were forced to do this. You know, the songs about watering the fields with the blood of young people. And it doesn't sound like it's funny, but for them, the relief of making fun of those lyrics and making fun of the music that was foisted on them. They were rolling on the ground laughing. And neighbors came over because they heard the songs and they were like, what is going on in that house? I mean, nobody had heard those songs in 40 years either.
Yeah. Wow. And what a moment to be in the middle of all that, to watch that unfold and to watch them play a song that once was a sign of torment and fear in their lives to now just laughing it off and making jokes about it.
Yeah, it was a triumph.
Yes, absolutely. In what ways did learning about Arne's story and writing about it change your perspective on the world?
Oh my gosh, it made me so grateful that I've had the life that I've had, that I just happened to be born in a place of peace and prosperity. It also it connected me more with music. I had been a flute player, as was Arne, and I had lost my interest in music as an adult, and I picked it up again, and that was really, I'm still terrible, but it was a pleasure for me to reconnect with that part of myself. It really made me believe, Dorothy, and this won't surprise you at all, in the power of storytelling, telling our stories to be understood and to be heard and to try to make sure something like this never happens again. Hearing him tell terrible stories of what happened to him, and he held no judgment and no anger toward these people because he believed that they were forced to do it in the first place, made me much more forgiving of the people in my life, you know, who had harmed me on a much lesser scale. It also emboldened me to tell the truth about my own life experiences and do so in a way that was full of curiosity and compassion, as opposed to feeling full of needing to blame or even just feeling I needed to hide and keep things to myself.
Mm-hmm. I think it's storytelling, from what I've learned anyway, from interviewing my own father, is exactly that, absolutely healing. My father had told me after I had interviewed him about the last couple episodes right before we finished his entire story, he kind of mentioned to me, he said, "Hey," he said, "you know, something weird happened like last month. I stopped having nightmares."
Wow.
He's like, "I stopped having nightmares, and I usually have them like once every week or every couple of weeks. And of course, it's always about being back in the Khmer Rouge." But he said, he said, "Baby, I stopped having nightmares like about a few weeks ago." And I was just blown away. And the fact that you had approached this book with such heavy responsibility and the responsibility to get it right and to do it justice, I think just goes to show that you were the right person for the job. I think there are many people who might try to take this story and not take it on with such responsibility. The fact that there are so many stories out there that people still keep within them, and this idea of not having their stories feel like it's important is so prevalent within the Khmer Rouge survivors. There's this level of silence that I feel like is upon the community, whether it be cultural, whether it be the fact that, as you said, many of them believe that it's just not important. There's something really, really incredible about validating that history and validating that pain and that trauma. What lessons do you believe the current generation can learn from Arne's story?
You said so many things that I want to respond to, not least of which is your dad's nightmares. You know, it's like his brain was still telling him the story. The brain was still working overtime at night. And now that it was out there in the world, his brain could rest, is the way it sounds to me. So, what value is his story for this generation? Well, on a macro level, all genocides are the same. They all start from this misbegotten notion of a kind of utopia, but that's usually the oppressor is forcing this view on a community. Mm-hmm. They always starve the people physically. They make people weak with hunger. They separate families, mothers from children, husbands from wives. It's almost like there's a playbook. I know there's not, but I think it's really important to see the similarities of what happened. What happened in Cambodia is not dissimilar to what happened in the Congo, for instance. Mm-hmm. So that's just one thing, is to like zoom out and see that this happens. It's probably happening again somewhere, and we're not aware of it. Yeah. I think another important lesson is to believe survivors. What you said about people not feeling like their stories are important, you know, we signal that with our lack of interest and our disbelief. And it's really another level of harm that is done to survivors after the fact. So I think that's important. And I guess, you know, keeping your humanity, which Arne did, and it sounds like your father did, during the absolute worst, crushing darkness, is a testament to the human spirit that I guess some people are broken, but most people have within them a spark that, with love and with listening to their stories and with respect for them and care, can be brought back to life.
Mm-hmm. Where is Arne today?
He lives in Cambodia most of the year. He comes to the United States once a year, or he did before the pandemic. I'm not 100% sure. You know, he's still coming back to the United States, both to perform and to raise money for the arts organization. I just haven't seen him lately because I've been going off in a different direction.
Well, thank you, Patty, for coming on here and sharing kind of the insight behind the book, the process, your journey with the storytelling. I think it is so important that we have these books available for people to lean on. I believe that there are not enough books out there about the Cambodian genocide, and people who can stand up for the survivors and tell their story in the most authentic, truthful way is what we need more of. And especially being a Cambodian American myself, just seeing content like this out there is validating. As I mentioned, it makes us feel like, yes, the trauma was there, and it is important despite of what history books think differently of. You know, I mean, when I was growing up, I didn't have much of a paragraph about the Cambodian genocide, if any. So books like this is very important. And I really appreciate you coming on here, sharing your process. And as I said, you were most definitely the right person to hold Arne's story and share it with the world.
Well, it was a total privilege for me to be that person and to create a book that makes people who had an experience like his feel seen, and that helps people who didn't have that experience have some empathy for it. And I also just want to thank you for your work. I think you have a legitimacy in your community to help ask those questions. As you know, your generation within the Cambodian community. And I hope that other people in your generation have the opportunity to follow your lead.
Where can people find this book, Never Fall Down?
It's on Amazon. It's in bookstores. Sometimes it gets banned in high schools, but that's another topic for another day. It's available. And it's available in Khmer, in Cambodia. It's been translated. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Patty, for coming on and sharing. I know the listeners will get a lot of value out of this.
Thanks, Dorothy. Thank you so much for today's conversation.